So for chapter 21, we're going to use the 2013 free response AP practice question number 1. So it starts with directions, which is show all your work, indicate clearly the methods you use because you will be scored on the correctness of your methods as well as on the accuracy and completeness of your results and explanations. So number 1, it says an environmental group conducted a study to determine whether crows in a certain region were ingesting food containing unhealthy levels of lead. A biologist classified lead levels greater than 6.0 parts per million ppm as unhealthy. The lead levels of a random sample of 23 crows in the region were measured and recorded. The data is shown below. And then here we have your stem and leaf plot explaining your data. So you have to answer, which is A. What proportion of crows in the sample had levels that are classified by biologists as unhealthy? B. The mean level of the 23 crows in the sample was 4.90 part per million, and the standard deviation was 1.12 parts per million. Conduct and interpret a 95% confidence interval for the mean lead level of crows in the region. So here we have the answer key, which shows you what you need to answer. It says for question 1, the primary goals of this question were to assess a student's ability to 1. Use a stem and leaf plot to answer a question about a distribution of data, 2. Identify and compute an appropriate confidence interval after checking the necessary conditions, and 3. Interpret the interval in the context of the data. So for solution A, you should have wrote something similar to 4 of the 23 crows in the sample had a lead level greater than 6.0 ppm. Therefore, the proportion of the crows in the sample that were classified as unhealthy is 4 over 23, which is equal to about 0.174. Part B, so step 1 identifies the appropriate confidence interval by name or by formula and checks appropriate conditions. The appropriate procedure is a 1 sample t interval for a population mean. The conditions include 1. The sample is randomly selected from the population, and 2. The population has a normal distribution or the sample size is large. The first condition is met because we were told that the crows were randomly selected. The sample size of 23 crows is not considered large, so we need to examine the sample data to assess whether it is reasonable to assume that the proportion or the population distribution of lead levels for all crows in this region is normal. The stem and leaf plot shows no strong skewness or outliers, so we will consider the second condition to be met. Step 2 is correct mechanics. A 95% confidence interval for the population mean is given by said formula. The critical value for 95% confidence based on 23 minus 1 equals 22 degrees of freedom is T equals 2.074. The 95% confidence interval for U is therefore equation listed below. So the equation is 4.90 plus or minus 2.074 times 1.12 over the square root of 23, which is equal to about 4.90 plus or minus 0.484. Which is the interval 4.416 or 5.384 parts per million. Using the raw data rather than given summary statistics, the 95% confidence interval is 4.411, 5.3803. In step 3, interpretation. We can be 95% confident that the population mean lead level among all crows in this region is between 4.416 and 5.384 parts per million. And so here's the scoring chart. The question is scored in 4 sections. Section 1 consists of Part A, Section 2 consists of Part B, and Step 1, Section 3 consists of Part B, Step 2, and Section 4 consists of Part B, Step 3. Each section is scored as essentially correct, partially correct, or incorrect. Section 1 is scored as followed. Essentially correct is E. If the response provides the correct numeric answer as a decimal or as a fraction with work shown. Partially correct if the response provides the correct numerical answer as a decimal but does not show the fraction that produced the answer, or shows a fraction with the correct numerator but an incorrect denominator, or shows the correct fraction but computes an incorrect answer. And lastly, incorrect if the response does not meet the criteria for E or P. Section 2. Essentially correct if the response identifies a one sample t interval for a population mean, either by name or formula, and also checks both the random sample and the normality large sample condition correctly. Note, any reasonable comment about the normality displayed in the stem and leaf plot or another appropriately sketched plot is acceptable. Partially correct if the response identifies the correct procedure and checks only one of the two conditions correctly, or does not identify the correct procedure but does check both conditions correctly. Incorrect if the response identifies the correct procedure but it does not check conditions correctly, or does not identify the correct procedure and checks at most one condition correctly. In Section 3, essentially correct if the response gives the correct confidence interval. Supporting work is not required, but if included, it must be correct. Partially correct if the response gives an incorrect but reasonable confidence interval with appropriate support or appropriate supporting work shown, or gives a correct confidence interval with incorrect but appropriate supporting work shown. If the response identifies a one sample z interval as the correct procedure in Section 2, then the response earns a P in Section 3 if this interval is calculated correctly. Incorrect if the response makes use of an inappropriate procedure for a confidence interval about a population mean. Section 4. Essentially correct if the response gives a reasonable interpretation of the interval that includes 4 elements. 1. Estimating a mean. 2. Inference about a population. 3. 95% confidence. 4. Context, lead level, ppm, and crows. Partially correct if the response gives a reasonable interpretation of the interval that includes both of the first 2 elements and one of the last 2 elements, or if the response gives a correct interpretation of the confidence level in context, lead levels, or parts per million, but does not attempt to interpret the confidence interval. And lastly, incorrect if the response does not meet the criteria for E or P. Each essentially correct E response counts as 1 point, and partially correct response counts as half point. 4 is a complete response, 3 is a substantial response, 2 a developing response, and finally 1 a minimal response. If a response is between 2 scores, for example 2.5 points, use a holistic approach to determine whether to score up or down, depending on the strength of the response and communication. And that completes our AP practice free response question for Chapter 21.